Technologies from the 80s have been making a comeback lately. Cassette tapes were popular in the 1980s, and consumer CD players first arrived in 1982. What you might not know is that there's another technology from the 80s that's becoming increasingly popular today. In fact, this audio technology from the 80s is the most in-demand feature on all of the DACs and streamers that I currently review. If a streamer or DAC doesn't have this technology from the 80s, many people just won't buy it. Admittedly, I am stretching things here just a little bit, but far less than many of you might think. The technology that I'm talking about is the Inter-IC sound protocol. It was invented in the 1980s by Philips. It was intended to transport data from one IC, or integrated circuit, to another inside an audio device. You might know the Inter-IC sound protocol by a different name though. Sometimes it's written as I²S, sometimes it's written as I²S, but it's always called I²S these days. And it might come as a surprise to you to learn that it's been around for over 40 years now, and that it was actually invented by Philips. Many people think that I²S was actually introduced or invented by PS Audio. Their claim to fame is that they saw the opportunity to take I²S from being an internal protocol and actually take it external to communicate from one component to another. That trend caught on, and today I²S is a protocol or connection type that many audiophiles won't do without. But I've started to wonder if I²S is actually all it's cracked up to be. I started researching to see if I²S is really that much better than any other connection type. Is it as good as many people claim it to be? And so first up, let's talk about why Philips created I²S in the first place, and why PS Audio then adopted it for external communications too. And to set the scene, we need to understand the types of data that are being communicated by the various digital audio protocols. Firstly, of course, there is the data stream that represents the musical signal that we ultimately want to hear. That's going to include things like the amplitude or the loudness of the signal, and the pitch or the pitches of the signal if it's complex music. Secondly, there has to be a timing cue, or some information that tells the receiving DAC exactly when to output each of the different samples of sound. SPDIF protocols like coaxial, optical, and AES will embed that information in with the audio stream. And that means that the timing information has to be both encoded into the stream at the sending end and then extracted from the audio stream at the receiving end. That process at both ends can cause an issue that's referred to as jitter. And jitter is basically a word that means timing errors. What many of you won't know is that USB audio actually does the same thing, where the timing information is embedded within the audio stream by the sending device. Where USB is a little bit different though is that the DAC in many cases, or most cases, will just ignore that information entirely and do its own clocking or timing at the DAC end. And so that's great if your DAC has a really good clock built in, but there can also be a few reasons why that could be worse. And we'll get to those reasons in a few moments. Before we do though, let's talk about how I²S is often carried. Although there is no agreed single protocol for the transmission of I²S in the audio industry, most manufacturers these days are choosing to use HDMI sockets, plugs, and cables to send I²S between the different devices. That does make it a little bit tricky and confusing for many people though, because I²S is not compatible with traditional HDMI for video. The cables are interchangeable though, because ultimately they're just wires going through a cable and attaching to pins at each end. However, there's even still a catch there, and we'll get to that shortly too. But first, let's wrap up the conversation of why I²S might be preferable to other protocols like USB. In the I²S transmission protocol, the timing information is carried on separate wires. In other words, it's not embedded within the audio signal. That means there's no need for the encoding and decoding of the timing information into and out of the audio signal, and that can reduce the amount of timing errors or jitter created in the process. And as jitter is reduced, what you'll generally hear from a subjective point of view is a smoother overall sound with a better sense of space, both in terms of soundstage size, but also separation of individual sounds. And when I talk about the sound becoming more refined or smoother, what that means is it's generally easier to listen to with less fatigue, but no less detail. In fact, often you'll get even more detail. And so if both systems are equal, let's say one is using coaxial, the other one is using I²S, if all other things are equal and it's only the jitter levels that are different, then the I²S one, if it has reduced jitter, should give you more sense of space, more sense of refinement, and potentially even more sense of detail. But this isn't only about timing and jitter. In addition to carrying that basic timing signal, the number of wires and connections available from an HDMI cable mean that you can also carry extra data in I²S that's not available through other protocols. For example, I²S actually carries more than one set of timing information, and that can get really useful. However, it's also the additional data capabilities of I²S that start to become its potential problem. Unlike the defined standards such as coaxial digital, optical digital, and USB audio, I²S has no standards. Every manufacturer can choose to set up the HDMI sockets or whatever sockets they want to send and or receive I²S in whatever way they want. Some have even chosen to use connections like the RJ45 connection used for Ethernet and networking instead of HDMI. Although you will find that as time's gone by, HDMI seems to have won out overall in almost all cases I've seen. The problem is, though, that there are 19 individual connection choices on an HDMI plug, and which of each of those 19 pins is used for the different data connections is not a point of agreement. One thing that does tend to be common is that pins number 1 and 3 tend to be the ones used for the audio data itself. The problem is that sometimes pin 1 is the positive and pin 3 is the negative, and other times it's switched around. The same is also true with the pins that are used to tell the receiving device, in other words the DAC, which of the signals is for the left and for the right channel. That data is normally carried through pins 7 and 9, but again the positive and the negative can switch between them, which can then result in your channels being switched between left and right. What should be in the left might end up in the right, and vice versa if you've got your settings wrong. Of course, there is then also the timing information we mentioned before. That comes through on a series of connectors referred to as the bit clock data, and those particular signals dictate to the DAC exactly when each of those samples should be played back. But with I²S, there's also often an additional set of timing data referred to as the master clock data. It's a high frequency clock signal, and it's often used by the downstream DAC for doing things such as oversampling and filtering of the digital audio signal. It's not crucial, and therefore not all devices will output it, and not all devices will receive it. You can start to see how this gets really messy, and I'd love to tell you at this point that we're done and start to make sense of it all, but we're not quite there yet. I²S also has to tell the receiving DAC whether the incoming data is DSD, like you'd get from a SACD for instance, or if it's PCM, which is the same format that you would get from a streaming service like Tidal, Qobuz or Apple Music, or from a CD player and or from ripped files that you might have taken from the CDs that you own. Sometimes the signal that tells the DAC that the incoming data is DSD will be on pin number 15, other times it's on pin number 14. And then sometimes the DSD data for the DSD audio also gets communicated differently across a different set of pins. But that's getting us into an area that's way overcomplicated for what we're here about. All you really need to know to get the most out of this video, and potentially the most out of I²S if you choose to use it after this video, is that the data and the various signals can be carried in all sorts of different ways through the HDMI cables. And that means there is a huge range of potential variations between different products on the market. But thankfully, there's also generally a pretty easy way to ensure that your sending device, maybe your streamer, and your DAC, which is receiving the information, can talk to one another effectively. And that's because most DACs on the market and most streamers on the market now will let you choose within the settings which specific HDMI setup to use to send I²S out or to take I²S in. So long as one of your devices, either your streamer or your DAC, or your CD player on your DAC, whatever the source device is, so long as one of the two devices lets you choose which type of I²S setup you're using, you're going to be fine. Sometimes it can take a little bit of digging through manuals and online resources to find out exactly what the setup is from one or other devices. But once you find out what one of them is, if the other one lets you adjust its settings, you'll be able to match the two up. But let's pause for a moment at this point and take a breath. Let's recap what we now understand. We know that I²S has potential benefits over other transmission protocols for digital audio because it separates the timing information out from the audio stream and carries it through its own dedicated wires. That means less encoding and decoding of the signals, which can reduce the amount of noise or jitter created within those signals. However, we've also learnt that it comes at the cost of some complexity, because with all the extra wires and connections needed and the lack of one individual standard, the different wires and connections can go to all different pins on the plugs. So we need to be able to make sure that our source device and our DAC are talking the same I²S language. And so that means that we need to compare how our source device does it and how our DAC does it, and make sure that at least one of them is able to be changed to suit the other. And to be clear here, you only need to change one device. So ideally, I would always look at the DAC as the receiving device and adjust it to match my source device, which is most often going to be a streamer these days. And if that is all done correctly, the theory is that we should automatically get better sound. But do we? There is another potential catch here. Even though these are all digital audio protocols, the signals themselves have to travel through wires as fluctuating voltages. That's unless you're using optical, and then optical has its own problems because it requires the signal to be translated from electrical into optical pulses or light pulses and then back again at the other end. And again, that encoding and decoding process can introduce issues of its own. And so because with all of the electrical transmission protocols, as opposed to optical, because with all of those we're talking about voltages running through wires, all of those are creating their very own electromagnetic fields. On top of that, they're also influenced by any electromagnetic fields around them. And for that reason, the quality of the shielding on the wires and the way the wires are laid out internally and the way they're constructed internally within the cables will all make a difference to what you hear at the other end. Sadly, this is true with any cable carrying audio. It would be great if it weren't true, but it is. And that reality means that any cable carrying audio, whether it's digital audio or analog audio, between two devices is capable of picking up noise from the environment around it. Basically, the cables act like antennas. They pick up the noise from the environment and they transmit it into whatever device they're connected to. And then in addition to that, what's going on inside the cable is important too. Because as wires carrying voltages run near to each other, they start to influence each other with their own electromagnetic fields. And so the exact internal layout of a cable can influence the way the signals within are carried through the cable and arrive at the other end. I had always assumed that I²S would be more immune to this kind of issue because all the different wires were separate, all the data was being carried separately from each other, and so I figured it was probably going to be pretty much a cable agnostic protocol. And so I've been using a nice super HDMI cable that's designed originally as a video cable and getting fantastic results. Or at least I thought I was. When I then received the Ricable Supreme Mk2 HDMI cable to give it a review, I didn't expect any difference from the Super cable. Swapping from the already excellent Super HDMI cable to the Ricable Supreme Mk2 cable delivered surprisingly different results. In fact, it was hearing the differences between those two cables that sent me down this I²S rabbit hole. How was it that these two well-made cables, both from respectable brands, could perform so differently carrying essentially a digital audio stream? I mean, the Super was good, but the Ricable was outstanding. As I said before, the Super cable is more of a high-quality video cable, and I don't know enough about video transmission protocols to really understand how video and audio might be similar or different. What I do know though is that the Ricable Supreme Mk2 has been specifically optimized for those wanting to use it for I²S. You can still use it for video, but it's been optimized for these audio situations. As such, according to Ricable, they've optimized the quality of the wires to maximize signal integrity, and they've enhanced the shielding with what they call triple enhanced shielding, I think was their wording, and that's again going to try to make sure that the electromagnetic fields internally and externally aren't interfering with one another. And then finally, still according to Ricable, they've used twisted pairs of cables within the wire, and that's intended to make sure that all of the signals travel exactly the same distance and end up arriving with perfect timing accuracy at the other end. It's also possible that by having those twisted pairs, the way the electromagnetic fields interact with one another and the outside world will be optimized as well, but that's getting into an area that I'm still trying to understand myself. And so if everything that Ricable say in their marketing is true, it should be a great sounding audio cable for I²S communication. And based on what I've heard from the Ricable, it seems like all that marketing might be true. And even if all of that marketing is a bit embellished or overstated, the end result from a sonic point of view is still an impressive sounding cable compared to the already very good super cable. And so using I²S doesn't seem to negate the need for a good quality cable. Although my experiences would suggest that running I²S connections between devices with, say, a generic HDMI cable will probably still deliver better results than running a generic cable for coaxial, optical, USB, or AES. And so the baseline for I²S seems to start a little bit higher, but it can also improve to be even higher still. And so to make sure this is coming across very, very clearly, I am not for a second saying that you need to go out and buy expensive cables to enjoy I²S, but I'm saying you can choose to upgrade your I²S cable if you want even better sound still. As always, I recommend getting all of your components in place before you think about cables, but I've now confirmed for myself that it's worth investing in some better cables for I²S. And you might be wondering at this point, or you might have wondered this a few moments ago, whether or not galvanic isolation in your DAC, and sometimes isolation in the sending device as well, makes all of this cable chatter completely irrelevant. After all, what galvanic isolation is intended to do is theoretically prevent any noise from getting from the cable and into the downstream device. So surely that makes the cable irrelevant. If it's poorly shielded and it picks up a bunch of noise, it doesn't really matter because the DAC downstream is going to completely reject all that noise anyway if it's got galvanic isolation. That's always what I had understood galvanic isolation to mean, except it doesn't quite. Galvanic isolation works in a couple of different ways, either with a small transformer between the input and the rest of the circuit of the DAC, or by using an optical coupler which converts the electrical signal into an optical signal and then back to an electrical signal again. In both cases, these sorts of devices work really well at rejecting lower frequency noises. They're exceptionally good at preventing things like ground loop noise or general system noise, maybe from a transformer. The problem is, though, that they're very small components with the parts very close together. Even in the case of an optical coupler, you've got your receiving side and your output side very, very close together because they have to be. When the electrical pathways are close together like that, it essentially creates a capacitor. And in this context, that accidental capacitor is very, very good at blocking out low frequencies. But unfortunately, they pretty easily pass or pick up high frequencies. And that's all to do with the way the impedance of that accidental capacitor changes at different frequencies. But we shouldn't get too far into that because I'll rapidly hit my ceiling of understanding, and so I won't be able to explain it clearly. What matters, what we need to understand for this, is that high frequency noise is actually not particularly well controlled by galvanic isolation devices. As a result, high frequency noise like what comes from Wi-Fi, what comes from switching noise power supplies, what comes from appliances in your home with motors in them, like a fridge, and even really common devices in the home like LED lights and dimmer switches, all of those are constantly pumping out high frequency noise that's going to be in the environment around your audio gear and is not well blocked by galvanic isolation devices. And I'm not sitting here suggesting that you need to go away and throw out your fridge, ban your wife or your daughters from using their hairdryers, and only ever listen to music in the dark. The point is that you want to maximize the rejection of noise in your audio system throughout the system, not just rely on the galvanic isolation at your DAC, which doesn't actually do that much for the rejection of high frequency noise. And so instead what we want to do is to focus on using high quality, well-designed devices which are good at rejecting environmental noise. That could be from a better quality case design. It could also be that it uses a more optimized circuit design that places noise-affected devices further away from the outside of the component. And of course, it also means using cables between the devices that are more able to resist external sources of noise and or be more able to resist the creation of any interference inside the cable with the layout of the physical wires. And then another thing to think about is using protocols for transmission of audio that are more resistant to noise in the first place. And in the case of I²S, I don't know that it's necessarily better at rejecting external noise. I don't believe it actually is better at that. But if it's able to start with a lower level of jitter to begin with, then any additional noise brought in by environmental factors will leave you at a lower total jitter level than other potential protocols. And to make this all make sense, let's use some made up numbers as an example. Let's say that a coaxial connection between your streamer and your DAC has a baseline jitter level of 5 units of jitter. Again, these are all made up numbers. And if you then use the absolute best equipment and cables you can, and you keep the additional jitter created by external environmental noise down to just 2 extra units of jitter, then your coaxial connected system has a total jitter level of 7 units. If you then swap that same system from a coaxial connection to an I²S connection, and if the I²S connection has a baseline jitter level of just 3 units of jitter, after we add the environmental 2 units of jitter back onto that, now we're only at 5 units of jitter. And so both systems have collected the same amount of noise from the environment, but because the I²S started off lower to begin with, it comes out sounding better at the other end. And so that to me is the explanation of why I²S does tend to sound better in many cases over the other protocols. And I do recognize that I have massively oversimplified this. It's just a way to try to explain it for those that are new to the idea and want to understand it a bit better. What I want for this video is for the key takeaways here to stand out more than the specific technicalities. And so let's return to those key takeaways or key points now. What I've learned through this process is that I²S is an excellent transmission protocol if you have access to it. But without laboring this point, I can't stress enough that it's not to say that other connection protocols can't sound equally excellent. And so you're better off buying a great sounding setup that doesn't have I²S rather than prioritizing getting I²S in a system that doesn't sound as good, or maybe just that it doesn't sound as good to you. If you have a system that you prefer the sound of that doesn't have I²S, you should still buy it if you prefer the sound of it. As I discussed in my recent review of the Volumio Preciso DAC, it actually sounds better in my opinion communicating via USB with the Volumio Revo Plus streamer than by connecting those same 2 devices with I²S. So it's not a hard and fast rule, and you should trust your ears first and foremost. However, if you do decide to go down the path of building a system using I²S between your source and your DAC, it does seem to be worthwhile investing some money in a better quality I²S cable. The Ricable Supreme Mk2 HDMI looks to be a fantastic example of that, but there might be other examples out there too. And let us know in the comments down below if you found a great sounding I²S or HDMI cable for I²S. For those keen to check out an I²S cable that I can definitely recommend, I'll put links down below for the Ricable, but as I said, check the comments too, other people might have suggestions as well. And then finally, the other key thing to take away from this video is that if you are setting up an I²S connection between your source and your DAC, just be sure to match the settings between your DAC and your source so they're talking the same I²S language. As I said earlier in this video, I would leave the streamer or whatever source you're using set the way it already is. If you can find out which pins are carrying which information in that setting, and then adjust your DAC to match what's coming down the cable. You can do it the other way if you want to. I just always think that we should leave the streamer in its optimized settings the way the manufacturer designed it, and then adjust the DAC to take the best that it can give. And the good thing is that most manufacturers now are making this process very clear and very easy to do. Whether it's brands like Topping, Eversolo, Live, Volumio, they all seem to make it pretty easy now to understand the HDMI pin setup. And that's really it. You now know, I think, all that you need to know for consumer I²S audio. If you still feel like you need more help, or maybe some very specific help, you can always join my Patreon community where you have access to DM me, or you can now find me on the Minect app where I can answer your questions in a short text message, a short video, or we can even book a one-on-one video call. Minect is a paid service, but I've put the rates as low as Minect will actually allow me to try to make it as accessible as possible. And so check out the links for Patreon and Minect in the description down below. And if you want to learn more about why timing and therefore jitter are so important in audio, I've pinned a video here at the end that I think you'll enjoy next. For now though, a huge thanks to YouTube channel members, also to channel Patreon members, and of course to those of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.